I have a story to tell you of the man at 12 o'clock. This story happens in only one room, though this room was really big. Big enough that it could hardly be called a room. It had no walls, it had no ceiling. It had nothing but a floor that extended itself in every direction to seemingly infinite distances. The only visible boundaries in this room was a circle of chairs. 12 chairs, arrayed in a way that each was at an hour of a clock. These chairs were as metallic as the floor. They seemed to be protruding out of it like plants. In the darkness, in the void, there was this infinite room, or room of infinite. Two beams of light suddenly appeared out of nowhere from above, aimed at two of the chairs. They formed tubes around these chairs, tubes made of these particles of blue, purple, and white energy, dancing and mingling and forming an existence that turned itself into a man in both instances. Different men, mind you, one at 12 o'clock and one at 3 o'clock. The man at 12 o'clock was a gray-haired man, heavily bearded man, who most notably sported a bunch of really serious wounds, the first of which was the lack of an eye. The spot was still blank and still bleeding profusely as if he had just been stabbed. Likewise, he was missing a finger on an arm that was missing several pieces of flesh that seemed to have been sliced off. The same could be said for his right leg. Everything was still fresh. Everything was still bleeding very badly. Despite that, the man was not screaming, he was not crying. He was gritting his teeth and looking on blankly in thought. Surprisingly, the man at 3 o'clock was in even worse of a shape. Yes, indeed. Once a black-skinned man, he was now mostly scabs all over. Every inch of his skin was sizzling, fizzling. You could hear it crackling, cracking, to the sound of his weeping, the sound of his whimpering, which reflected off the surface of the floor and off the void around him, all around him, echoing, even though he was not screaming. The pain was clear when he grunted in effort in order to nudge himself out of the chair and onto the floor, slamming unceremoniously. This called the attention of the man at 12, who glanced down, curious. His finger was almost all regenerated. His arm was fully healed. He was wondering whether his eye would also regenerate completely or not, when the man at 3 o'clock looked up at him. A glare, a painful, painful glare, with the only eye that was not blind from the flames. In a hoarse voice coming from a burned, completely devastated throat, the man at 3 o'clock, now the man on the ground, asked, "You won't carry me, right?" The man at 12 looked at him with a hard stare. He had no words to say, except for the only words that he could say. "No, I won't." And so the man at 3 o'clock raised his head even higher, grunted in effort, yelled out, screamed even, and slammed his head against the floor, knocking himself out so that he could bleed to death. "10 minutes after the eye of the man at 12 had fully healed, the first man appeared on the chair at 2 o'clock. This man was dressed in full tuxedo and looked around confused, not understanding what was going on. He had short hair, seemed well preserved, late 20s, but had a couple of broken spectacles, which even surprised him. He took them out and looked at him confused. Then he squinted his eyes at the man on the 12 and asked, "Who are you? Where am I?" But the man at 12 did not stop looking forward, blankly, in acceptance of something dreadful. The man at 2 started to lose patience, but he was distracted by the appearance of a new person over at 9 o'clock. The woman was dressed in a full cloak and hood that covered all of her physical features. Nothing was visible to define her as a person other than some green and pink shoes that were a bit discernible under her cloak at the very bottom. She seemed confused by where she was and by what had happened to her, for she looked down in question, massaged her belly, and then her face, her hidden by the dark face. And she looked up, still witnessing the beam of light dissipating into nothing, and then looked over at the two men. And the man at the 2 asked her who she was, and she replied in a language that he did not understand. He asked her to speak in English, but she did not know English. When the man at 2 was again about to lose his patience, another person appeared, this time at 5 o'clock. This time she was a woman of, let's say, wearing something that befitted more clear personality. A buttoned-up shirt, a short skirt, leggings, high heels. She was obviously an office worker somewhere in the West. But the one thing that was off about her was that she was wearing a baseball cap that seemed to not have anything to do with her. She, too, looked down at herself, but this time it was her chest that she massaged, confused. She looked at her hands, then she looked around and asked in English, "What's going on? What? I don't understand. How am I alive?" The man at 2 looked over at her, confused. "What do you mean, how are you alive?" And she explained, I was in the office. Jim went crazy. What happened? Like, he put the hat on me and then he stabbed me. Was I dreaming? Am I dreaming now? Is this a dream within a dream? What's going on? Before they could fully come to terms with what was happening, maybe share stories, share some past events to figure out what was happening, 2 more people appeared. This time, they were very young. If they were past 18, everyone would be surprised. They showed up together at opposite ends. At 7 and 1 o'clock. But they still looked at each other familiarly. They recognized each other. They looked around and using voices that were high-pitched and childish, they asked what was going on. They didn't understand what was going on. They thought for sure that they were hurt. Were they dreaming? Were they in a hospital? It would be later understood that they were just involved in a school shooting as victims, or as people trying not to become victims, running for their lives. More people appeared. A black man that did not speak English, another black woman that did not speak English, and the rest were Asians, only one of which spoke English. They communicated as best they could and eventually figured out that they had all been on the verge of dying. Some were more convinced than others that they were dead. The man at 2 o'clock was convinced he wasn't. He was at a funeral. before he appeared there, and everything was fine. It was a normal funeral. He didn't know what was going on. Eventually, they all asked who was here before, and they all came to the conclusion that the man at the 12 had been there before all of them. And throughout all of this time, roughly half an hour, the man at 12 had not spoken, had not moved, had kept looking forward. One person, freaking out of their minds with concern and worry, tried to exit, to run out of the circle. Unfortunately, as soon as she left the circle, the floor gobbled her up. She yelled, screamed painfully, and then appeared again on her assigned chair with full memory of what had just happened to her. That person just began crying. She was not open to communication anymore, and everybody was very bothered about what had happened. And still, the man at 12 did not react. He just kept staring forward, ever forward, blankly, seemingly seeing something that they could not see. At some point, they thought that he was crazy, since such a different assortment of people had been gathered there. Maybe he was crazy, deaf, mute, blind. Who knew? Who knew? When they were discussing this, a voice showed up from around them, a voice echoing all around them as if coming from wherever world they were in. The voice of a god almost, speaking inside their minds, they realized soon. It explained to them that they had been teleported, transported, taken from death to participate in a game. They, as in the people who had taken them, were a race of aliens, extraterrestrial beings, superiors, as they call themselves. We are a race of superior beings. One of our games, we have many games, one of our games involves taking creatures such as yourselves, primitive, underdeveloped, from their deathbed. Since you are about to die, then why not die for our amusement and entertainment? For is it not much grander death to die for our benefit than to die for no reason? Then at least you have a reason. But more importantly, one of you has a chance to go back and continue living. They told them, all you need to do is win 4 times in a row. That is all you need to do. And if you win 4 times in a row, we will return you to your planet, to your city, to your home, safe and fully healed, in full health. This is our reward for your success. Good luck. You have 5 minutes to prepare. Now, of course, everyone understood the message. Such was obvious by their reaction. Upset, questions, denial, anger, all the stages of grief. But the man at 12 continued to look forward, blankly, refusing to meet their glares, their stares, their glances, any kind of look. He just looked forward, past 6 o'clock, at something. He refused to engage them. Blood now dried on his clothes, on his skin, his shredded, dirty skin, his beard, his eye. He kept on staring. And then it was the man on 2 o'clock that made the connection. Wait a minute, he said. All that blood. Did you already participate in some of this? How many did you participate in? They asked and asked and asked. But the man at 12 o'clock would not answer. He simply gulped. Inside, as the final countdown began, the voice told them, "Take your seats. Take your seats or you will be disqualified." And they did. The two kids, the old African man, the women, and the man at 12 was already sat down. The final countdown started. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Some cried, some cursed, some were silent, some had a really dedicated, serious look on their face, steeling themselves for what was coming to happen. Because the game involved hunting each other, killing each other until only two remained. Until only two remained. On the last 3 seconds, the man at 12 finally looked over at them. It was such a change, such a contrast to see him even just move his head and his eyes, that everybody felt his gaze. Everybody looked back and met his eyes. And they saw such dedicated concern, such regret. That's all he said, that's all he transmitted to them in those last 3 seconds. He said, "I'm sorry, but I got kids waiting for me."